What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And today, it's finally here. My Mobile Suit Gundam review. It's been a long time coming, especially because if you know me, you know that Gundam is one of my favorite animes of all time. Zeta Gundam, not the original one, but Zeta Gundam is probably my favorite anime of all time. But today I'm going to be reviewing the original Mobile Suit Gundam. So Gundam is a huge multimedia empire in Japan. It consists of anime, manga, novels, light novels, toys. It is just a huge cultural phenomenon, even to the point where in Japan there is a life-size Gundam statue outside of a Gundam museum. But I think they're taking that Gundam statue down right now. But at one point, there was a literal life-size, to-scale Gundam statue outside of the Gundam Museum in Japan. So it's really impossible to overstate the impact of Gundam from a socio-cultural standpoint in Japan, but it's also impossible to overstate its literary impact on anime. And that's really for two reasons. The first is that it revolutionized a genre. Before Gundam, there was the giant robot series, things like the Iron Giant, stuff like that. But Gundam created a subgenre of mecha. And mecha are the smaller versions of giant robots. They're generally piloted by someone. They're not sentient or sapient robots. So they're more realistic in that sense. And the second reason why Gundam is so important is because it raised the bar for shonen writing in general. So Gundam, huge multimedia empire, and also revolutionized the way people looked at anime, and in particular, the shonen demographic. So this review is going to be broken down into two parts. First is just a brief overview of Gundam, what it is, what the story is about, and the second part is going to be an examination of how Gundam complicated the distinction between the shonen demographic on one hand and the seinen demographic on the other hand, and how it raised the literary profile of shonen writing by complicating that distinction. And what's also important about Gundam is that it's incredibly historically significant. Gundam was released in 1979, and the landscape for shonen battle anime and manga has really never been the same. I mean, Gundam is for anime what Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind was for manga, in a sense. And if you think about it, just about every shonen battle manga that at least my generation takes seriously or respects postdates Gundam. So that's how you know Gundam had an enormous impact on the sort of writing that was brought to bear on the shonen demographic. So first, the overview. So Mobile Suit Gundam chronicles the one-year war between the Earth Federation faction on one hand and the Principality of Zeon faction on the other hand. And it's a huge war. I mean, not just because it lasted for a significant amount of time, but also because of how many people died. I mean, within the first week of the one-year war, if I'm not mistaken, billions of people were dead. I mean, the human population was radically reduced, both on Earth, where a lot of the fighting took place, but also in space, where a lot of the fighting took place. So, like I said, the one-year war is a huge war. Gundam chronicles that war of the conflict between the Earth Federation and the Zeon, Principality of Zeon, after humans have colonized space. So what is the Earth Federation? The Earth Federation is the global governing body of Earth and all of its space colonies. And it is a federation in the literal sense of the word, in the sense that it is a centralized governing body of autonomous entities. And it's similar to the way America is set up, with we have a federal government, but we also have state governments. So America is a federation. It's a particular type of federation, of course. It's also a republic, but it is a federation in the sense that the states are autonomous entities, but they are also all answerable to the federal government through our United States Constitution. So every state has its state constitution, but every state is also answerable ultimately to the federal government of the United States through the United States Constitution. So similarly, in Gundam, the space colonies are autonomous entities, but they are answerable to the Earth Federation. The Principality of Zeon is a space colony that declares war on the Earth Federation, ostensibly for, they say they're being oppressed by the Earth Federation, which is true, but they also have some ulterior motives. The Earth Federation, in response to the aggression of the Principality of Zeon, at the beginning, they were really getting their asses whooped at the beginning because Zeon kind of sneak attacked them. So they were being overwhelmed. But at some point in the story, actually very early in the story, if I'm not mistaken, the Earth Federation develops a new warship and the titular mecha called Gundam, the RX-78-2, if I'm not mistaken. And basically, due to a fluke, there's a young man named Amuro Ray, who's about 14 or 15 years old, who becomes the pilot of the Gundam. And due to his prodigious talent at using the Gundam and at being, he was never quite a strategist, but he was a pretty good tactician. And so due to his prodigious talents, he turns the tide of the war very slowly at first, but then very, very quickly towards the end in favor of the Earth Federation as against the Principality of Zeon. So that's a general overview of Gundam. So now let's talk about is Gundam, and this is a question that I haven't really seen a lot of people raise when they talk about Gundam. Of course, they talk about how great it is, how great the story is, how great the cinematography is, how great the characterization is. But I want to talk about the literary impact of Gundam and how Gundam elides that distinction between shonen on one hand and seinen on the other hand. I would say that most people, and this is mainly because the protagonist of the series, Amuro Ray, is, I don't want to say a young man. He's just reaching puberty, about 14, 15 years old when the series starts. Most people assume that because Amuro Ray is a young protagonist, which is distinctive of the shonen demographic, that therefore Gundam is a shonen anime. And I want to sort of explore that and complicate that assumption a little bit. I will say that for myself, I don't necessarily make the assumption that because Amuro Ray is young, that therefore Gundam is specifically targeted to the shonen demographic. And I say that because there are a lot of ways in which Yoshiyuki Tomino uses the ambivalence between shonen and seinen for a particular, or for lots of literary effects. And this allows him to use very unique theoretical framing devices that at least in 1979 were basically unheard of in a shonen anime. So first, let's talk about how Yoshiyuki Tomino complicates this distinction between shonen and seinen, even through the way the war plays out initially between the Earth Federation and the Principality of Zeon. So the first narrative maneuver that Yoshiyuki Tomino makes is to complicate the war between the Earth Federation and the Principality of Zeon by complicating the cause of the war. So the cause of the 1 year war rests on an important distinction between a federation on one hand and a republic on the other. So, like I alluded to previously, a republic is a specific type of federation. So federation is just a broad branch of government, but a republic is something that comes underneath the larger branch of a federation. So a republic presupposes that there is a centralized governing body, but a republic is also a system which ensures public welfare. It's designed to stop state oppression. It's designed to ensure certain rights and privileges of the people. It's designed to be a representative democracy, so it's democratic in nature. And a republic is also a way of codifying the legitimacy of state power as a function of the consent of the people who are governed. So, like I said, America is a perfect example of this because it's a federation, but it's also a republic. And this distinction between a federation on one hand and a republic on the other hand is really the impetus of the 1 year war, precisely because the Earth Federation is a federation, but it's not a republic. And that's what allows for the conflict, or at least the initial reason for the conflict on the side of the Principality of Zeon. The Earth Federation in Gundam is essentially a corrupt version of the UN. It is basically a plutocracy that is dominated by wealthy individuals. It's not even really dominated by region or by states or by national entities. It's just run by the wealthy individuals of Earth. So you can already see how this is a little bit more nuanced than your typical shonen. Furthermore, this is never overtly stated in the anime, which means that not only is it a little more nuanced than your typical shonen, but it also requires a greater degree of viewer participation than a shonen. Generally, in a shonen, you have two sides. One side you're supposed to agree with, and the other side you're very obviously not supposed to agree with. You can see this play out in many manga and in many anime where the sides are just, the line is drawn in the sand. One side is supposed to be mostly good, or you're mostly supposed to agree with it, and the other side is clearly not good, and you're generally not supposed to agree with it. But not only is that not the case in Gundam, but it's also left up to the viewer to tease out these political implications for themselves. So, like I said, generally in a shonen, the conflict is straightforward. But in Gundam, not only is that not the case with respect to the fight between the Earth Federation and the Principality of Zeon, but it's also the case that the viewer is a little bit more responsible for teasing out these subtle but very important distinctions and political implications of the distinction between a republic on one hand and a federation on the other hand. So I've talked a little bit about the Earth Federation, so now let me talk about the Principality of Zeon in a little bit more detail. So Tomino continues to complicate the cause of the 1 year war via the Principality of Zeon. So on one hand, you have an Earth Federation that's essentially a corrupt plutocracy. So that's one side of the conflict. But on the other side of the conflict, the Principality of Zeon is a fascist society. And when I use the term fascist, I mean it in the technical sense, not in the sense that is generally used to mean that somebody is just authoritarian. So, for example, a lot of people call Donald Trump a fascist, but in the technical sense of the word, Donald Trump is not a fascist at all. He's authoritarian, but he's not a fascist. So what do I mean by the technical sense of fascism? I mean a couple of things. First, I mean that fascism is distinguished by its authoritarian national populism. So there's not just an authoritarian figure at the top. There is a rise of authoritarian populism, a groundswell of support from the bottom. It's also, number two, it's also distinguished by the fact that the government subsumes civil society. So that means that the state invades every aspect of the person's life, even down to its intervention into civil society. So the state in a fascist society is not content to let there be a distinction between the state on one hand and civil society on the other hand. It invades civil society. And the third facet that distinguishes a fascist society is that they believe that violence is not only virtuous, but that violence is necessary for a nationalistic rebirth. So they think that violence is moral, that it's good, and that it in some way leads to a evolution of society. So this is the conflict in Mobile Suit Gundam. It's a conflict between a corrupt Earth Federation and a fascist society in the Principality of Zeon. So, like I said before, generally this distinction between good and bad is pretty clear in a shonen, but that's, again, not the case in Mobile Suit Gundam. And even in a shonen, even when it's clear that both sides may not be good, it's pretty clear that one side is better than the other, and that is usually signified by the appearance of the anti-hero. So an anti-hero might have some morally questionable qualities. The anti-hero might even have some villainous qualities, but in the end, they still possess heroic qualities. So it's the case that the factions responsible for the fighting in Mobile Suit Gundam are not themselves good. And when there is no good side, it allows for a more thorough exploration of political ideas. Why? Because humans, it's just human nature for people to tend to overlook the criticism of their side. But when you have two factions in a war who are fighting and neither side is self-evidently good, or at least one side is not really better than the other, it allows you to examine both sides in a more, I don't want to say objective, but in a more critical way. So right off the bat, the conflict in Mobile Suit Gundam does not allow you to engage in dichotomous thinking between good and evil, and as a result, it doesn't allow you to rationalize the actions of either side in the conflict. And as a result, not only does this stop the dichotomous thinking in the narrative itself, but it stops the dichotomous thinking in the viewer. Because as a viewer, when you see that there's a war, you instinctively want to root for one side as against the other. You want to think about why one side might be more moral or better than the other side. And Yoshiyuki Tomino, by creating this sort of conflict where neither side is good or neither side is clearly better than the other one, it doesn't allow the viewer to engage in that sort of dichotomous thinking between good and evil. So this is another way that Yoshiyuki Tomino complicates the distinction between shonen on one hand and seinen on the other, because this sort of ethical and political complexity is usually a feature of the seinen demographic rather than the shonen demographic. And this was especially true in 1979 when Mobile Suit Gundam first premiered. And just to sort of compare Gundam to one of its contemporaries, if you look at something like Space Battleship Yamato, for example, that was more indicative of the shonen demographic at that time than Mobile Suit Gundam was, because Space Battleship Yamato is very similar to Gundam in the sense that there is a intergalactic war going on. Of course, the scale of the war in Space Battleship Yamato is bigger. This is only a solar system-wide war in Mobile Suit Gundam, but Space Battleship Yamato has an intergalactic war that almost destroys Earth, similar to Mobile Suit Gundam. There were clear heroes and villains, and the backstory of the villains made them sympathetic, but they were still clearly villains. Even though Space Battleship Yamato had villains, they were still clearly villains. And so in Space Battleship Yamato, it was just indicative of this dichotomous thinking at the time in the shonen demographic that the conflict was just supposed to be between good on the one hand and evil on the other hand. And Yoshiyuki Tomino in Mobile Suit Gundam pretty much eschews this sort of convention. So that's one of the ways that Mobile Suit Gundam was pretty unique at the time it came out. And so now that we've talked about how Mobile Suit Gundam complicates the distinction between seinen and shonen by complicating the cause of the war, now let's talk about how war is used as an instrument in shonen and seinen, and the ways in which Mobile Suit Gundam also complicates that. So generally in a shonen, war is used for two reasons. One, it's used to showcase the heroic qualities of the hero, and two, it's used to show, you know, how the good guys beat the shit out of the bad guys. And so, like I've always said, conflicts are always an expression of a deeper ideological conflict in the narrative. And up until this point, that ideological conflict, at least in the shonen demographic, was largely around the conflict between good and evil. But Tomino used war to expand what counted as an ideological conflict. And he did this through a literary technique known as psychological realism. So this was the first time that, at least I'm aware of, that a shonen used, not just used psychological realism, but used it as an essential element of the plot within the context of warfare. So first let's talk about what I mean by psychological realism, and then talk about how Yoshiyuki Tomino uses it to great effect in Mobile Suit Gundam. I mean, it's really the foundation of the characterization in the series, and is partly the reason why Mobile Suit Gundam has some of not only the most memorable characters in shonen, but also the best characters in shonen, I would say. So Tomino used a level of psychological realism in Mobile Suit Gundam that was generally reserved for seinen, at least at the time. So again, this is very important. Looking back on this in 2017, Gundam might not look all that revolutionary, but if you were alive in 1979, you would immediately realize that Mobile Suit Gundam was unlike really anything that came before it. It was truly unique when it came out. So again, it might not look like much in 2017 because we've gotten series after series after series of these sort of techniques, but in 1979 it was truly revolutionary. So what do I mean by psychological realism? So psychological realism has an emphasis on direct characterization. So what I mean by direct characterization is personality that is revealed directly through speech, through action, or appearance. And it also includes being directly told So psychological realism is based on indirect characterization. So that means again, personality revealed through speech, through action or appearance. You have to sort of intuit it. You're not directly told what X character believes. The narrator doesn't tell you that X character has these motivations or these reasonings or these beliefs. You kind of have to intuit it, and it's implied by the way the characters act. So it's based on implied character traits rather than being directly told by the author what a character's traits are. Psychological realism also has an emphasis on internal conflict as the driving force of external conflict. So internal conflict is the conflict that happens in a character. So it's at the level of decision making, for example. Should I do this? Should I do that? What do I believe? Why do I believe it? And external conflict is generally the conflict between characters. So the warfare, for example, would be an example of an external conflict. It's a conflict between characters. Internal conflict is conflict within the character. And so psychological realism, like I said, really works by using internal conflict as the basis for the driving force of the external conflict in the narrative. And it's based on the impact, and it also works in a sense vice versa as well, because it's also about the impact that external events have on the psychology of the characters themselves. And so one of the interesting things or unique things about Gundam is that it takes this psychological realism and it ramps it up really to the nth degree, to the point where, again, I mean, I'm not actually a historian of anime and manga, but from everything I've read and everything I've studied, I mean, Mobile Suit Gundam was really one of the first shonen animes that had a realistic depiction of warfare. So it had child warfare in it, because Amuro Ray is not only the child who's involved in the war. I mean, there was one point in Mobile Suit Gundam where the Principality of Zeon recruits a child to engage in reconnaissance missions against the Earth Federation. I mean, so it had not just realistic depictions of warfare in the sense that children were involved in warfare, but there were even different ways and different levels of child involvement in the war. I mean, and that was probably just because of the scale of the war. I mean, if you engage in a war where 50% of the human population is erased within a week, then you probably need to tap all your resources for war, and sometimes those resources include children. Mobile Suit Gundam also had realistic depictions of war orphans. In fact, on the White Base warship that was developed by the Earth Federation to fight against the Principality of Zeon, there are war orphans on the ship, Kika, Katz, and Lex. And also, Yoshiyuki Tomino was referred to at the time as Killamal Tomino. And the reason why he got that nickname is because people died in Mobile Suit Gundam. People who were meaningful to the plot died. People who were major characters died. I mean, it was a realistic depiction of violence in the sense that people who were a major part of the plot died. And in fact, I remember the first time I ever watched Mobile Suit Gundam. If I'm not mistaken, it was the summer of 2008. And I remember watching the show, and at one point, a major character dies. I mean, this guy had been around for like 20 episodes, and he died. And not only did he die, but he died in a suicide mission. And at that point, I paused the video for a second, like, what the hell did I just watch? So I played it again, and then I rewound it. I'm like, did he really just die? And then I was like, well, maybe he didn't really die, because sometimes there's the bait and switch in shonen where you think someone dies, but they really didn't die. And so I'm watching like, okay, maybe he really didn't die. So the episode ends, he's still dead. And I'm like, okay, maybe in the next episode we'll learn that he really didn't die. And I was really, really shocked because I really was not expecting that in an anime that a lot of people refer to as shonen. I just was not expecting that at all. And so one of the important features of Gundam is that the main focus of Gundam is not just on the war itself, but the war in Mobile Suit Gundam creates the context for a clash of ethical and political ideologies, and the scope of these ideologies is quite large for what we would a lot of people would consider again to be just a shonen anime. So let's talk about some of those ideological conflicts in Mobile Suit Gundam. So one of the very unique features of Mobile Suit Gundam was the theme of environmentalism, which again in 1979, thinking about this now, I really didn't understand fully what I was watching the first time I watched Mobile Suit Gundam, but in retrospect, 10 years later, almost, it's really quite remarkable all the things Yoshiyuki Tomino was able to do. And at a time when so Mobile Suit Gundam, of course, happens in the aftermath of environmentalist movements that were happening all around the country. And that was at least in part sparked by humanity's final goal and achievement of the goal of reaching outer space, in particular the moon. So that whole space race actually kicked off a lot of environmental movements, and so you can tell that Mobile Suit Gundam happens in the aftermath of these environmentalist movements. A person who's very knowledgeable about this, and you could probably look up some videos of his discussions about this on YouTube, is Neil deGrasse Tyson, who talks about the origins of the environmentalist movements all over the world and how those environmentalist movements gained steam in the aftermath of humanity's ability to reach the moon. And so you could really tell that Mobile Suit Gundam was very conversant in the dialogue of environmentalism when it came out. And it's not just about how humans treat nature, although that's an important component of it. It's about unrestrained population growth and how that unrestrained population growth leads to conflict over finite resources. So for those of you who have studied things like population growth, you're probably familiar with Malthusianism. So Malthus, I forgot his first name. I can't remember his first name, but Malthus was a guy who studied sociology and studied the impact of population growth on sociology and studied the impact of population growth and how that would strain finite resources, leading to conflict over those finite resources. So again, Mobile Suit Gundam is very conversant in the ideologies of environmentalism. And 80 years before the beginning of the One-Year War in Mobile Suit Gundam, the elites of the world realized that the Earth simply can no longer sustain the human population. And so the plutocrats all combined their political power and their clout to create the Earth Federation, and then they used the Earth Federation as a way to force poor people to migrate into space. So Mobile Suit Gundam is directly at the intersection of various ideologies about poverty, about environmentalism, about politics, and about the way those things interact with each other. Another theme of Mobile Suit Gundam, another way that it uses psychological realism, is its discussion of human evolution. So the humans who are forced to migrate to space become known as space noids. And a major plot element is that the space noids are evolving into what becomes known as new types. So this is pretty freaking remarkable, because not only is it about environmentalism and not only is it about human evolution, but it's faithful to the science of human evolution. And science is a concept known as biogeography. So biogeography is what happens when a species that is uniform, it is one species. What happens when a species diverges from itself because one part of the species gets geographically isolated from another part of the species. So you can take a species, and At some point, there will probably be some environmental disaster that separates the species. And so one part of the species occupies one geographical niche, and another part of the species occupies another geographical niche. And so as time progresses, they evolve into two different species. And so this is exactly what happens in Mobile Suit Gundam. The space noids, by living in space, they become evolutionarily divergent from the humans who are on Earth. I mean, this is just really freaking mind-blowing, the way that Yoshiyuki Tomino sets this up in Gundam. And not only that, but the evolutionary divergence between the people on Earth and the people in space also becomes a very important psychoanalytic metaphor. So space noids and new types see the elite of Earth as being weighed down by gravity. At one point in Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam, Char gives a very brilliant speech in which he talks about how humans have to leave the cradle of Earth because we're parasites that are draining the Earth of its resources. And at some point, we have to leave the cradle of the Earth to reach our destiny in the stars. And so the elites in Mobile Suit Gundam, the plutocrats who have created the Earth Federation, they fear space, and they fear space, and they exploit and their exploitation of Earth's resources is a form of infantile omnipotence, which I won't go into in great detail, but anybody who studied psychoanalysis knows about infantile omnipotence. And not only that, but Yoshiyuki Tomino takes this a step further. So not only is Mobile Suit Gundam about environmentalism, not only is it about environmentalism and how that impacts the evolution of humans, but it's also about the ethical implications of human-directed evolution. It's bioethics as well. So new types in Mobile Suit Gundam have higher levels of consciousness. They're not psychics, but it's almost as if they were psychics. So they can telepathically communicate with other humans. They can sense the thoughts and intents of other people. Their intuition is so strong that it's almost as if they can predict the actions of other people. And so they've reached this higher level of human consciousness. And so the Principality of Zeon and the Earth Federation try to artificially engineer new types to use as weapons of war. Greatness. Greatness. So now let's talk about another aspect of the psychological realism in Mobile Suit Gundam. So I've talked about how there were realistic depictions of warfare in Mobile Suit Gundam, and one of the ways that was showcased was in the PTSD of the main character Amuro Ray. So there are extremely realistic depictions of the emotional and psychological consequences of war. So again, a classic example of this is Amuro's PTSD. And again, I didn't understand this the first time I watched Mobile Suit Gundam, but on the second and third rewatch, I picked up on this, like, dude, does Amuro really have PTSD? I mean, again, in 1979, realistic depictions of warfare like this was just freaking unheard of. And Yoshiyuki Tomino very beautifully and very concisely captures the symptomatology of PTSD. So Amuro Ray becomes withdrawn, he starts brooding, he has feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, he has flashbacks. I mean, I still remember the scene where Amuro Ray is in a fetal position in his bed, in his cabin on the white base, and he's just having flashbacks to earlier fights that he was engaged in. Amuro Ray becomes impulsive and moody and angry, as evidenced by the fact that at one point he says, you know, F this, I don't want to fight in this war anymore, and he just steals the Gundam and leaves the white base. And also, we see Amuro's PTSD manifested in the strain that it puts on his interpersonal relationships, especially with Frau Bo. I mean, when he's going through, basically PTSD, war trauma, his connection and his relationship with Frau Bo starts to break down as a result of that. And this is a perfect example of the psychological realism in Mobile Suit Gundam. And so we see the full range of the effects that the war has on Amuro Ray in terms of his psychosocial functioning. And like I said, this was really incredible for the time that Mobile Suit Gundam came out. I mean, PTSD wasn't even that widely discussed in society at large, but here's a freaking anime in 1979 talking about war trauma and how it leads to PTSD. And not only that, but he takes it a step further by showing the interrelationship between the psychological trauma of Amuro Ray and its connection to a very classic shonen cliche. So let's talk about how Yoshiyuki Tomino very expertly manipulates our expectations and our ideas about a classic shonen cliche. So there is a cliche in shonen anime and manga where as the protagonist gets stronger, his strength functions as the conduit for his heroism. In other words, the stronger he gets, the more heroic he becomes, because now he has the power to impose his moral will on the plot and other people within the plot. So Tomino actually turns this formula on its head because he asks a very important question. He asks, how should we realistically depict Amuro Ray's growing strength? So at the beginning of Mobile Suit Gundam, Amuro Ray is obviously a genius. He's an inventor. He's an engineer. He has a very prodigious talent for piloting the war machine known as Gundam. And at the beginning, he starts off a little shaky, but as time progresses, his strength grows to the point where, I mean, calling him an ace pilot is really an understatement. I mean, at one point in the series, Amuro Ray takes out like 10 people in less than 2 minutes. I mean, he gets strong as hell by the end of Mobile Suit Gundam. And so Tomino asked the question, how should we realistically depict Amuro's growing strength? What would really happen to a person? Outside of shonen cliches, what would really happen to a person, and not just a person, but a child, when an increase in their strength, when an increase in their talent and expertise directly correlates with the death of other people? Wow. Greatness. Greatness. So Amuro's growing strength is not a conduit for his heroism in this sense. It's an exploration of his trauma. His growing strength actually makes him less heroic. Instead, his growing strength leads to war trauma, i.e. PTSD, and that war trauma and PTSD actually cripples him. I mean, this is the main reason why he runs away from the white base. I mean, our heroes are supposed to be brave. They're supposed to be courageous. But what happens when their continued existence in a context that traumatizes them actually makes them less heroic? And not only that, but what happens if we realistically depict this process happening to a child? And not just happening to a child, but what would happen if we then use that process to subvert a very classic and common shonen trope? Wow. So in this way, because we see that Amuro Ray's fighting actually cripples him in some sense, his trauma actually becomes the means for exploring his humanization, exploring his fallibility. We see that Amuro isn't some transcendent heroic figure at all. In the end, he's just a child soldier. A genius child soldier, but a child soldier nevertheless. So finally, let's talk about Amuro and Char. No Gundam review would be complete without at least touching on or talking about the rivalry between Amuro Ray and Char Aznavour, aka the Red Comet. So another way that Yoshiyuki Tomino elides the distinction between shonen and seinen is how the characters interact with each other. There is a very high degree of emphasis on the interpersonal relationships in Gundam. And so it's not just internal characterization, but it's also external characterization as well. And one of the features of the Gundam franchise is how history repeats itself. And so certain interpersonal relationships reproduce themselves over time. It happens in So if one thing happens in Mobile Suit Gundam, it tends to repeat itself in Zeta Gundam and in Double Zeta Gundam, and also to a certain extent in Victory Gundam. So in the same way that war creates the context for the clash of ideologies, war also lends itself to the reproduction of certain social relations and how those social relations manifest themselves in the interpersonal relationship of the characters in the series. And the most important one in Mobile Suit Gundam is the rivalry. The rivalry reproduces itself again and again and again in just about every series of Gundam. And like I said, you should know where I'm going with this. It's the rivalry between Amuro Ray and Char Aznavour. So one of the most important but most overlooked aspects of Gundam is that it's a Bildungsroman. So a Bildungsroman is a German word that refers to a particular genre of literature. Bildungsromans are coming-of-age stories about the psychological and also moral development of the main protagonist. But it can also refer to the psychological and moral development of other characters within the series. But its main emphasis is on a coming-of-age story of the main protagonist and how they develop psychologically and morally as the narrative progresses. And the growth of Amuro Ray is predicated on his not just interpersonal relationship with Char, but on his interdependence with Char Aznavour, who is, I would say, the main antagonist. Yeah, he's the main antagonist. He's not the villain of Mobile Suit Gundam, but he is the main antagonist. The rivalry itself between Char and Amuro Ray drives the growth of both of the characters. Gundam is the archetype for the modern battle shonen in this way. The rivalry happens, for example, in Naruto with Naruto and Sasuke. It happens in Dragon Ball Z with Goku and Vegeta. It happens in Hunter x Hunter with Killua and Gon. And think about that. Think about the rivalry as a motif in shonen battle manga and anime, and then try to find one that predates Mobile Suit Gundam. I'm not saying you can't find it, but what I am saying is that shonen motif may not have been created by Yoshiyuki Tomino, but boy was it explored in a way that really had never been done before. Gundam takes the rivalry in battle shonen and just ramps it up to the nth degree. And in this rivalry between Amuro Ray and Char Aznavour has multiple interpersonal layers. But this video is already like almost 50 minutes long. I can't talk about all of them, but I will talk about one important layer, and that's the idea of masculinity. So, spoiler warning, if you haven't seen Mobile Suit Gundam, there will be a little bit of a spoiler, not that big, but it is very important. In one sense, the link between war and masculinity is trivially obvious, right? Philosophers have been talking about this connection for probably as long as war has been around. War is about overpowering your adversary through direct violence. So there's always been at least this implied link between violence, strength, and manhood. And this, of course, certainly comes up in Gundam. But Tomino complicates this theme of violent strength and manhood, and he does it by exploring how vulnerability and weakness is also linked to masculinity and manhood within the context of war. And this is where the relationship between Amuro Ray, Shara Aznavour, and the character named Lala Soon comes in. So again, spoiler warning. I'm just trying to warn you guys if you don't want to know what happens. So Shar is a commanding officer in the Zeon army, and he's tasked with developing the new type Lala Soon for warfare. I alluded to this earlier in my discussion about bioethics. And Shar comes to look at Lala Soon as his little sister. However, something very tragic happens. So Amuro Ray meets Lala Soon in a space colony, but he doesn't know her connection to Zeon or Shar. He doesn't know who she is. Their connection is based on the fact that they're both new types. And like I said, new types have enhanced consciousness where they can sense the thoughts and the emotions of other people. They can link to each other and communicate telepathically. And so this is what happens when Amuro initially meets Lala Soon. But again, he doesn't know who she is. And so Amuro develops not only this connection to her, but he also becomes romantically interested in her. His meeting with Lala Soon really explores his budding puberty, so to say. However, there's a conflict between Amuro Ray and Shar Aznavour. So they're fighting. Shar is fighting in his red Zaku, and he's fighting Amuro Ray, who's in the RX-78-2 Gundam. And at one point, Amuro Ray is about to kill Shar Aznavour. However, Lala Soon interposes herself so that instead of killing Shar Aznavour, Amuro Ray accidentally kills Lala Soon, and this is a huge tragedy. Like I said, new types in Mobile Suit Gundam have a higher level of consciousness, and so they can feel when people die. I mean, they can feel. I mean, they really feel it when a consciousness basically is winked out. And so this was a very tragic moment in Mobile Suit Gundam. And it's an experience from which Shar and Amuro Ray never really recover. And this experience is the one that really solidifies their rivalry. Shar, from this moment on, hates Amuro Ray. That eventually changes when we get to Mobile Suit Gundam, but when Lala Soon initially died, Shar Aznavour hated Amuro Ray for this. And it really transforms their rivalry, not just from a rivalry in terms of warfare, but it transforms it into a rivalry of manhood. And for Amuro Ray, he feels like Shar is a coward for manipulating women into fighting wars, and Lala Soon especially in this sense. I'm not sure how old Lala Soon was, but I doubt she was even 18 years old. So again, this is Mobile Suit Gundam touching on child warfare. And it becomes this tragedy, the death of Lala Soon, becomes the conduit for the shared vulnerability of both Shar Aznavour and Amuro Ray. Amuro Ray is seen as a hero amongst the Earth Federation. He has prodigious talent. He's more than an ace pilot. He's turning the tides of warfare. Everybody knows him. He's heroic. Same thing for Shara Aznable in his Red Zaku. He is renowned for his strategy and his tactics, for being a very good commander, for being a specialist, not just in thinking about warfare, but also fighting warfare, because he's an ace pilot. And these two figures are seen as heroes, and yet their interpersonal connection becomes the conduit for their shared vulnerability. Like I said before, we see heroes as brave, as courageous, sometimes as larger than life mythological figures, and yet when it comes down to it, the thing that they share is not their heroism, it's their vulnerability and their helplessness. So, man, Gundam is truly one of the classics, truly one of the great pieces of literature of all time. Like I said before, I don't see a distinction between high culture on the one hand and low culture on the other hand. What I see is great literature, and Mobile Suit Gundam definitely, absolutely belongs in the class of great literature in general. And like I said, the same rhetorical techniques that I apply to something like Shakespeare, I also apply to Mobile Suit Gundam. And after this review, I would hope that you would understand why. So this was your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.